Well, we will proceed. So welcome everybody to the December 3rd event at Brock University celebrating the International Day of Persons with Disabilities. My name is Maureen Connolly, and I am the chair of the Anti-Ableism and Mental Health Working Group at Brock University. Today's event is sponsored by the Anti-Ableism and Mental Health Working Group, the Office of Human Rights and Equity Services, and the Center for Adapted Physical Activity. We're delighted to bring you this event today. We are going to start with a land acknowledgement, and then we will get into the event. I'm grateful to work and live on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, many of whom continue to live and work here today. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and is within the land protected by the Dish and One Spoon Wampum Agreement. And as a settler, it's my responsibility to do more than simply speak land acknowledgements. It is my responsibility by my actions to engage in the practices that allow for inclusion, respect, equity, and ongoing acknowledgement of Aboriginal, Indigenous, and BIPOC people and their contribution to our education system, our country, and our system of laws and freedoms. So welcome everybody for being here today. Thank you for being here today. And thank you to our two interpreters who will be assisting us in interpreting today, Rosalie and sorry, the other name just went right out of my head. But Rosalie will be one of our interpreters. And then we have another interpreter who I will acknowledge as soon as I see her on the screen. So yeah, that's my senior moment for today, and I'll acknowledge that right up front. Today we're going to work in a three-section kind of presentation. The first part of our event today, we will be acknowledging our award recipient of the Accessibility Inclusion Recognition Award at Brock University. Then we will be engaging with Jay Dolmage, our speaker from University of Waterloo, who is going to be giving us a presentation and kind of workshopping in a lot of ways the notion of academic ableism and how we can engage in our institution in ways that are more conscious and reflective of how we participate in ableism, sometimes unconsciously and sometimes thoughtlessly. And so that's going to be our second part of today's event. And then our third part of the event will be an opportunity to celebrate and interact with our Innovative Designs in Educational Accessibility group. And we have two award winners in that national competition who are going to be here with us today. So a great day to celebrate disability in our world, not as a tragedy, but as a delightful and possible and wonderful way of being in the world. So welcome to all of you. Thanks for being here. I also want to acknowledge Allison Rothwell, who's played a huge role in getting this event together and who I work with closely at Brock University. And Allison is the Accessibility and Inclusion Advisor at Brock University, working in the Office of Human Rights and Equity Services. And I want to acknowledge Demi Toms, the Inclusive and Adaptive Specialist in my research center, who has also been invaluable in setting up this event today. I wouldn't be able to do anything that I'm doing without the support of remarkable people around me. Demi's already indicated that you should turn off your microphone so that there isn't, cats or buzzsaws or weather or other interesting noises in your house being shared with the rest of us. So we'd appreciate that. And then when we have opportunities for questions and interaction a little bit later, we'll invite you to participate then. Okay, so it's my pleasure to announce the recipient of Brock's Accessibility and Inclusion Recognition Award. And this is an award we offer on a yearly basis to staff, faculty, and students who contribute to inclusion and anti-ableism at Brock University. And this year, our recipient is Sydney Sloan. And Sydney is a student who works as the advocacy coordinator for the Brock University Students' Union. Sydney had wonderful nomination letters highlighting her commitment to awareness, anti-ableism, and advocacy in the mundane acts of everyday life. So, which is super important in inclusion and accessibility. So making sure your documents are accessible is absolutely as important as being on the front lines and decrying oppression. So the day-to-day engagements are just as important as the larger engagements. So Sydney's been involved in these day-to-day engagements. She has a lot of commitment to inclusive practices across the board and has participated in numerous professional development and awareness campaigns. She's also affiliated with Heads Up Canada, which is a concussion education group. And Sydney herself lives with post-concussion syndrome and is both a vocal and vulnerable presenter on the realities of living with a post-concussion syndrome. And it's our pleasure to acknowledge her contribution to anti-ableism and inclusion at Brock University. And Sydney, congratulations and thank you. Thank you for your commitment and your contributions. Wonderful. Okay, thanks everyone. And I'm hoping that that at some point we're going to be able to get Sydney to, oh, Sydney, wonderful. We're seeing Sydney in the chat. Thanks, Sydney, for your words in the chat. And thank you so much, Maureen and Allison, truly an honor. Well, Sydney, we're delighted that you're here and the honor is all ours. So thank you so much for your service and well deserved. I hope you were able to pick up your award at the print shop, and I hope you display it with pride. And you're getting all kinds of love and feels in the chat, so make sure you take a look in the chat room and see all the congratulations from our participants today. Wonderful. Okay, so now it's my great pleasure to introduce Jay Dolmage, who is our guest speaker from the University of Waterloo. And Jay is going to be talking to us today about anti-ableism and about academic ableism. So Jay, over to you.
Thank you very much. So to begin with, the fact that you all have an anti-ableism and mental health working group is really terrific. And I already mentioned that to Maureen, but every university needs a group like this, right? And unfortunately, most universities don't have this kind of approach, right? Mental health, yes, that's something we talk about a lot, but we don't frame that according to the kind of idea that we work within these ableist institutions. And naming it is really important. So today, my talk is designed to help us kind of collaborate so that we can address some of those ableist attitudes and the practices that are built into higher education. I also want us to look at some of the means that we have to work with to address ableism that often are kind of minimal, kind of temporary, but that we need to work with no matter what, right? And at the same time, understand the cost of a minimal and temporary approach and what that means for disabled students, staff, and faculty. And then I also think we'll have some time to talk about and explore some alternative tools and approaches that might create a more accessible future. That kind of maps across a temporality for this talk, which is looking at ableism and disability in higher education before COVID, talking about some of the things that have happened since the pandemic began, and then thinking about how we can use this shift in education to think about disability and its place in higher education after COVID. The other thing I'm going to say is that I am focusing a little bit more on STEM disciplines today and settings as much as I can, and I'll explain why. I have three kind of spatial metaphors that I use to talk about ableism, and I'm going to share my screen here. Give me 1 second. Sorry, let me just find the correct button for this. Here it is. Here we go. Okay, so you're seeing my slide here. That's just my title slide. The first image that I want to share with you is of steep steps. And this is an image of a bright pink staircase at Brock. It's a metal staircase that kind of goes back and forth between floors in the Marilyn Walker School of Fine and Performing Arts. And the anti-slip matting on the stairs and on the landings of this staircase are bright pink. And this image is used by the Faculty of Humanities at Brock as a kind of way of drawing attention to the kind of modern and dynamic and exciting research and teaching and community that's happening at Brock, especially in the School of Fine and Performing Arts. You know, it's beautiful. It captures this kind of spirit of innovation and art, but it also kind of exempts physically disabled students from that metaphor. The truth is your campus is lousy with stairs, and so is my own campus at the University of Waterloo. Many of you, probably most of you, have specific associations with steps like these, having traveled up them many times or having avoided them. At the University of Toronto, students even participate in an annual Great Barrier Hunt. The event, organized by Students for Barrier-Free Access, aims to raise awareness of accessibility issues on campus. And using the format of a scavenger hunt, participants perform an accessibility audit of U of T buildings. The thing is, it's easy to find lots of examples of inaccessibility. And these activities highlight the ways that traditional campuses are designed only for a certain range of bodies. That's the case at U of T, it's the case at Brock, it's the case at Waterloo. And even new features like this inspiring staircase, they exclude students with disabilities from the key aesthetic, cultural, artistic, and intellectual centers and messages of university life. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing for a sec. So the steep steps metaphor puts forward the idea that access to the university is a movement upwards, and only some people survive that movement. The steep steps, physically and figuratively, lead to the ivory tower. And that tower is built on things like standards, ideas like rigor. In many ways, it's an identity that the university and people within the university have embraced, that we sort people, right? That only some people can make it. And I want to suggest that we've mapped the university this way for particular reasons. Because universities construct spaces that exclude, that's part of their function. Not only have people with disabilities been traditionally seen only as objects of study in higher education, rather than as teachers or students. Not only has disability been a rhetorically produced stigma, which could be applied to other marginalized groups to keep them out of the university, but the university is still seen as performing a societal and a cultural function of pulling some people slowly up the stairs and arranging others at the bottom. The truth is the university does sort the population, and it sorts it by a medicalized and legalistic definition of ability. It does it really effectively. Universities continue to function to keep certain groups of people out of the workforce, away from status, away from knowledge and dialogue and power, and not just through admissions, 24% of first-year universities self-declare as having a disability, most commonly related to mental health. So that was 24%. But that 24% is in stark contrast to the 6 to 9% of students who actually get help. The National College Health Assessment shows us that we have a cohort of students right now, maybe we could call it a generation. And there's two things that stick out about this generation. One, they're much more likely to experience higher education as disabling. And two, they're much less likely to seek help. That's a bad combination, right? So 27% of Canadians have university, 20% of Canadians have university degrees, but only 17.6% of Canadians with disabilities have degrees. Well, more students with disabilities are enrolling than in previous eras. Nearly 2/3 are unable to complete their degrees within 6 years. A really modest estimate suggests that 10% of people with disabilities leave post-secondary institutions before obtaining their desired credentials, but it's probably more like 30% if we extrapolate from those numbers of students who never seek help. Disabled students are also likely to have up to 60% more student debt by the time they leave. And as Sarah Mohammed reveals, debt is particularly onerous for students with disabilities who require more time to complete their degrees. And that means they have lower application, admission, and graduation rates, as well as higher rates of leaving and switching programs. And we know that that intersects with things like the Canadian and Ontario Student Loans Program, right? And creating this debt inequity. I think the simple extrapolation tells us that at least 100,000 Canadian post-secondary students right now need accommodations but never seek them. In the States, some studies show that 2/3 of college students don't receive accommodations despite the fact that they have disabilities. And those who do seek accommodations are likely to do so only in their 3rd or 4th year of school. So, I mean, what we get from this is this idea that we have a larger group of disabled students than before, but a culture that tells them that it's not okay to ask for help. And I think of the steep steps as a metaphor there. The idea is you're supposed to work harder. The idea is you're supposed to overcome disability or compensate for it. And there's stigma around the fact that having to disclose disability is still seen as a negative, right? So I think we need to look at faculty as well. A recent study in the state revealed that academics in Canada receive little institutional support in obtaining disability accommodations. Most Ontario universities don't even have an accommodation policy for faculty, and definitely not one that extends to non-tenure track faculty or graduate student teachers. Stone reported that only 42% of Canadian universities have a written disability policy. And, in the 8 years since then, very little has changed. The policies that do exist largely don't centrally fund accommodations. It means that accommodations come out of individual department and unit budgets, and that faculty are compelled to disclose their disability to the people who have control over their careers, like chairs and deans. So we shouldn't be surprised that there's a culture of silence and passing. And we shouldn't be surprised when we lose disabled teachers and researchers. The steep steps are in place for students, but they're also firmly in place and extremely steep for teachers and researchers as well. So I want you to think a little bit about how this steep steps mentality has shaped your own education. Who and what helped you up the stairs? Where were they the steepest or most difficult for you? What pushed you back? And where did you start on the stairs based on your own privilege or lack of privilege? Looking at the steep steps in a world in which COVID has changed how we think about buzzwords like community is jarring. Further, in a world in which the prevalence of overt and systemic racism needs to be foregrounded in all that we do, we have to understand these steep steps as well as disproportionately impacting students of color. We've been working hard to address racism on campus, and I know it's been a widespread issue at schools in Ontario. There have been specific issues, but there are also big systemic issues that we have to talk about. For example, we know that Black males are disproportionately placed into categories of special education that are associated with really poor outcomes at the K-12 level. Yet Joy Banks has shown that Black students with disabilities in higher education experience really a lot of difficulty accessing disability support services. So for the same group of students, a disability diagnosis at the K-12 level is hastily applied and often, puts them into things like the school to prison pipeline. And at the post-secondary level, the same group, it's so much harder for them to get this help, right? And there are big barriers in place. A recent report on the Toronto District School Board showed that having special educational needs in high school meant that you're less likely to go to university, and this has been getting worse over time and not better. Notably, being a student of color also makes you more likely to be labeled with these special educational needs. So we see the presence of ableism in higher education pretty persistently. When we understand as well that universities create doctors, nurses, special educators, therapists, all of these people who learn how to rehabilitate or cure disability, and sometimes how to tokenize or minimally include it. So seeing disability as fixable or eradicable, or wanting to fix it or cure it or get rid of it, that's very different from seeing disability as desirable or understanding disability as an identity and culture. In short, educating people to erase and diminish disability ensures limitations on our knowledge about bodies and minds in general. And the continued struggle to fight for small accommodations and adjustments for students with disabilities means that we're in an era still where people with disabilities are fighting for the right to an education. We have to recognize the long history of exclusion and experimentation upon people with disabilities, as well as the more recent history of academic ableism experienced by them. In the COVID era, we've also begun to see our campuses differently. I look at a staircase like this and I break it into 6-foot chunks, right? That doesn't really fit very well in a crowded stairwell, and it doesn't fit in an elevator. But also the temporal or the timing steps of going back to campus have also forever changed. Who's going to have a choice about teaching or learning in person on campus? Who will get the choice to learn or work from home? What social and student-centered spaces will replace physical ones, and who will be included? How is teaching changed right now just by moving a lot of these steep steps online with the same demands of student time and productivity, but without the overhead costs of buildings and classrooms? What new regimes of control and surveillance have been built or are being built? And how are these going to impact disabled students? I'm going to give you an example here of exactly what I mean. Right. What you're seeing here is a slide, okay? It's a screenshot from one of the 4 dense, small fonted pages of rules given to students taking an online midterm at Laurier University, just down the street from me in Waterloo a year ago. The slide says that students must not use touchpads or touch screens, have to use only an external mouse, keep their upper body in view for the entire exam, keep all work surfaces visible by arranging a webcam to view them. Students also had to buy webcams at a time when the global supply chain made webcams unbelievably expensive. And many students were panicked because they believed that if they didn't get a webcam in time for their exams, they would fail, right? The most notable thing on this slide is a bit where it says that if students need to go to the washroom, they must shout. The word shout is used. I need to go to the washroom and I will come back quickly, into their camera. All of this stuff, right? Just so that the instructor can give a test that has not been properly adapted to online learning. The attitude towards students situated them all as potential cheaters, not as potential learners, community members, or co-constructors of knowledge. And this is just one page of the instructions, right? The 4 pages, all of which had to be followed or else the test result would be invalidated. In a way, they're a perfect distillation of the ways we've adapted steep steps to the pandemic, maintaining, retaining, and adding to the steps rather than trying to remove them. All right, just I'm going to unshare here for 1 sec. So since COVID, I think we may be paying slightly more attention to some of these barriers. And yet at the same time, so many of the community supports that used to be in place on campus are not being accessed by students. As a recent Maclean's article on students with disabilities and COVID-19 concluded, barriers haven't been removed, barriers have changed. The Toronto Science Policy Network reports that according to a survey they conducted in 2020, around 3/4 of graduate students reported that COVID-19 negatively impacted their ability to conduct research. They were increasingly reported anxiety, depression, feelings of helplessness, loneliness, or being overwhelmed. 72% indicated that those increased as a result of the university's response to the pandemic. And 26% of graduate students were considering taking a long-term leave of absence. And we've seen that with staff, faculty, students, they're leaving, right? According to Okufa, since COVID, among faculty, a full 4 in 5 agree that the university's pandemic response has had a negative impact on them. And faculty report significant negative impacts on their own mental well-being. So during COVID, I think we see a changing relationship between disability and teaching, one that I think should help us to understand the disabling impact of education. And this signals a shift here in my presentation, away from the focus on the steep steps of academic ableism towards an examination of the alternatives we've been given as we temporarily, sometimes minimally adapt teaching and learning for disabled students, staff, and faculty. In my work, I put forward the metaphor of the retrofit as a way to explore these responses and reactions we have to steep steps. This idea of retrofitting is especially important for us to understand right now as we make changes to our teaching, but mostly see these changes as temporary. To retrofit is to add a component or accessory that doesn't make a product function or fix a faulty product necessarily, but acts as a kind of correction. It adds a modernized part in place of an old one. It allows a product to measure up to new regulations. So automobiles and factories are retrofitted with new parts so that they can pass emissions guidelines. Retrofits are then seen as mechanical, mandated, a matter of maintenance. They aren't seen as creative. It's also often forced or mandated, right? And an entailment of the retrofit is that it should be given low priority. So as a building is retrofitted to accommodate disability, ramps are added onto the side of a building or around the back instead of at the main entrance. The stairs aren't torn down like the pink steps we saw at Brock. Instead, there's another way around. And for disabled people, that other way around often sends the message to them that they're a secondary concern, that they're a backdoor presence at the university. I think we're all becoming much more aware of retrofitting in the COVID-19 era. Restaurants and businesses have plexiglass walls built. Tables and chairs are now a measured distance apart. Those are all retrofits. There are new laws and regulations, right? And some of these retrofits have been criticized. Some are wise and well thought out, while others simply feel performative, like a mask that's covering somebody's mouth but not their nose. I think we can all recognize stairs in the built environment around us, and we know that often around those stairs there are accessible features that allow people to get around them. I know, for example, that those pink stairs I showed you from the new Performing Arts building can be circumvented by taking a new, highly accessible talking elevator. But a lot of the time, the workarounds aren't really that helpful at all and leave disabled students in awkward positions or gradually wear them out and warn them away from higher education. I'm going to show another slide here. Okay, and this is a slide from Hull University in the UK. It's a tweet, actually, that was posted by a student named Sarah Marie Da Silva from the University of Hull. She posted the picture on Twitter showing how she is forced to take in her zoology lectures. When she arrives at the lecture, there's only one place for her to sit, in the doorway at the back of the room. That doorway has a push-button entrance and an automatic door, allowing her to get into the room. But when she gets in, there's nowhere to go. Right, and in this lecture theater, she's sitting at the very back of the room. There's a small little cubby area where the students come in that automatic door. Then there are stairs that come down towards the front of the room, and you have to go down those stairs to access any of the seating in the room, which is at tables that fan out as you move down through this amphitheater. So she's stuck in the back of the room there, right? And I think, when she gets into the room, there's nowhere for her to go. And this is what so many of the physical, but also curricular and cultural layouts within higher education actually look like. Disabled students may be there, may be able to get into the room, but their access is so clearly an afterthought. Their participation is already minimized. And it should be no wonder that we're losing so many disabled students. We acknowledge that our students come from different places, that they're headed in different directions, yet that does really very little to change what we do in the classroom. Most often, the only time disability is spoken or written about in class is in the final line of the syllabus when students are referred to the Office of Disability Services. The message to students is that disability is a supplementary concern, and then that it's not the teacher's concern, not really a part of the course, it's at the back door. The nature of the retrofitted accommodation requires that we make no lasting changes to our pedagogy or to the culture of the university. And we see this because, to begin with, there's such a limited range of accommodations that we can offer to students because our Office of Disability Services are so underfunded and overworked, right? That sends a message as well. The underfunding of these offices sends a message that the university actually doesn't want that many disabled students. In other facets of student support, offices get more funding the more students that they serve, right? And that's not always the case in Disability Services Office. So the vast majority of accommodations offered are the exact same accommodation. 3/4 of the time, it's extended time on tests and exams. And this is a big issue for, I think, a lot of us in the room, because maybe you're like me and you don't offer tests or exams very often and never in a timed way. If that's the case, then I think that's good. But if we keep working with disability services and they're only offering that accommodation, we're short fusing the process. We need a much, much broader repertoire of accommodations. In writing classrooms like the one that I work in, where I rarely give tests and I rarely lecture, I know I have to expand the range of accommodations that can be offered. You know, when you look at a department like, the School of Fine and Performing Arts and the Faculty of Humanities at Brock, I guarantee when they talk about the classroom, when they talk about teaching, right, they're talking about innovative teaching methods, experiential learning, all of these kind of buzzwords that move beyond lecturing, testing, and rote learning. But we continue to work with this really narrow range of accommodations, and there's a mismatch there, right? The accommodations stay stuck in a really old, Fordist, industrial kind of educational regime where rigidity and uniformity and timing reign supreme. And our classrooms then don't look like that anymore, but that brings us closer to what we might call malicious compliance, where following the letter of the accommodation law actually hurts the student. You can imagine what accommodations might be offered to the student taking that ridiculous exam at Laurier University. The Disability Services Office would have to take weeks to figure out a workaround just so that we can continue teaching that old way, right? And our time and energy needs to be much better used. Unfortunately, perhaps in part due to the ways that accommodations can remain stuck in that older educational regime, faculty and students don't have positive attitudes about accommodations. Students report negative attitudes from faculty when they disclose disabilities. Faculty and students have in general not had very much contact with disability, and that leads to bias and ableism. Students with and without both learning disabilities and psychological disabilities actually view them as insurmountable problems or as correlated with low ability, even though professionals don't see their disabilities that way. That said, retrofitted adjustments are still legally mandated, and we need to continue to offer them. But how can we allow retrofits to become permanent? What are some ways that in higher education we've taken accommodations that were made over time and turned them into mainstream pedagogical techniques? And how can we do more of this? I think we've had an opportunity over the last 16 months to redesign higher education in ways we never have before. We've never given this opportunity before, right? Yet too few people were talking about accessibility as part of that process. Universities spent a lot of time and money investing in surveillance test proctoring software, and they didn't spend that time developing alternatives to outdated teaching models that rely on testing. There's some irony that ableist demands for physical attendance and participation that teachers and universities used to cling to so tightly have now been so easily left behind. asking to have a grade converted to credit rather than a numerical grade, asking for an extended deadline, you know, for faculty getting extra time on a research grant or on a tenure deadline. All of a sudden, anyone who wanted those things could have them. And disabled people can hardly count the number of times they were denied those things and stigmatized for even asking about them in the past. That said, you know, now if expanded access is being called for, I think we can ride that momentum. Of course, most of the ableist demands of academia could slide right back into place, and hopefully others are gone for good. The advocacy of actual disabled people is the key here to what should be determining the future. For example, as we were forced to pivot online, we learned how to caption video maybe, or how to provide transcripts, or how to share those things outside of the class so that students could access them at any time. Well, before COVID, we knew, listening to disabled students, for example, at the University of Illinois, that that's what they had wanted, right? They were asking for recorded lectures as videos, transcripts for those videos and lectures, as well as course textbook and instructor notes and slides that they could engage with offline. Multiple studies were saying that that's what these students wanted. And those are all things we began to offer quite broadly during COVID. So my suggestion is, let's keep doing it. It's a small piece, right? But we have to, right? It's increased access for everybody. And we realize that even though there was so much pushback to doing it before the pandemic, it's a place to start. The question then is, what did you do in your teaching, in your classroom, but also in your own research environment in order to keep your research going, in order to continue teaching? Did some of those things increase access more generally for all students or for all of your participants? And can you keep doing those things? What have you changed about your teaching since the pandemic that you could keep doing in order to increase accessibility? So my challenge is to you is to think again about those barriers that students might be facing right now and explore how they get accommodated. What are the workarounds? How have we built accessibility into this forced pivot to online learning? How will we need to retrofit our teaching in ways that remove barriers when we finally do return to campus, you know, knowing that so many of us already have? And how will those sync with our own access needs and our own safety? I think we need to transition to thinking about what accessible teaching might look like after COVID. And to do this, I have a third metaphor. It's very much like a Three Little Pigs story here, right? I'm supposed to come up with a solution that solves all of these issues. The metaphor that I have and that I use for this is universal design. And what I'm going to show you here is an example of universal design, the Canadian Museum of Human Rights in Winnipeg. Instead of the stairs that we saw in previous images, the center of this space, architecturally but also aesthetically, is a level entranceway into the center of the space. We can see that level entranceway in the slide. It's down at the bottom right of the slide. There's a kind of sloped ramp that leads people into that entrance. The building itself looks like a large spiral with ribbons of stone wrapping around it and narrowing towards the sky. But everyone comes in the same way, on the ground level. And that spiraling and ribboning is mirrored by the ramps throughout the interior of the space. On the interior, a series of ramps crisscrosses the space, and I'm showing a slide now that shows this overlapping of ramps and provides the central metaphor and argument that the building is making and the stories that it tells. This slide shows an overhead view of those crisscrossing ramps, which take every visitor through the same journey. The inspiration is a design philosophy called universal design. Their site goes on to define this according to the following premises. One, universal design is not a design style, but an orientation design based on 4 premises. Disability is not a special condition of a few. Disability is ordinary and affects most of us for part of our lives. If a design works well for people with disabilities, it works better for everyone. And finally, usability and aesthetics are mutually compatible. So then universal design becomes this third image. Instead of the stairs that only some people can climb, instead of the retrofit that tells disability it comes in the back door, right? How do we design spaces? How do we design cultural spaces on our campus? How do we design classrooms for everyone, right? It should matter at a museum of human rights, but it should really matter in an institution of higher learning as well. Of course, changing physical structures was always also seen as a way to challenge ideological ones. Universal design was then a philosophy of teaching adapted from those architectural roots. And the three basic principles of universal design for learning are multiple means of representation to give learners various ways of acquiring information and knowledge. Example of that is simply, that this talk, I'm speaking, we have sign language interpretation, we have a captioning, we have a transcript that I've shared and slides that I've shared ahead of time and that can be made available for people in the future who couldn't even be here, right? So there's a lot of pathways into getting the information that's being shared. Multiple means of expression then gives learners alternatives for demonstrating what they know. And the best example I can give there is about time tests and exams. What a kind of blunt instrument and what a narrow channel for giving learners all opportunities to show what they know. And if we could expand those channels, so many more students could be included, right? There's so many barriers created by having such a narrow channel for students to express what they know. Multiple means of engagement are things I think we're doing more in the classroom now through hands-on learning, experiential learning, innovative teaching techniques, and interaction, right? Those things tap into learners' interests and offer appropriate challenges and increase motivation. The issue is that so many of those technologies that we use to engage students are not accessible, and we need to make them accessible to students. Okay, so that's universal design. Again, right, if we look at that Canadian Human Rights Museum, and we think because the space is planned with that kind of accessible main avenue for movement and interaction, we're able to have a common space for everyone instead of demanding that some bodies come in the back. The question then is, how do we build the future of the university in that same way? Imagine if we conceptualized all structures, even huge institutions like universities, for the broadest possible spectrum of users, instead of for one particular idea about what thinking is and what the body looks like. Steve Jacobs, writing about the electronic curb cut effect, suggests that many of the things we now take for granted, technologies that improve everyone's quality of life, they were originally designed for people with disabilities. So pretty much everything cool that your cell phone does, your smartphone does, those technologies, be it GPS, text to voice, voice to text, optical character recognition, even email, those were all originally really expensive, really limited technologies only for disabled people. And when we began sharing them for everybody, we realized how much they could do for us. And I think there's so much in the educational sphere where if we made it accessible to everybody, we'd understand that we can change the culture, right? I think that universal design allows us to understand disability from a justice and cultural perspective rather than that legal and medical one that I talked about earlier. It asks us to foreground intersectionality. It means we understand that disablement disproportionately impacts Black and Indigenous people in Canada who face different and more barriers, right? It also means we need to listen to disabled students, staff, and faculty through groups like yours, right? And allow them to shape the future of education rather than privileging only service professionals. It means that the goal is not just a better university for disabled people, but a better university for everyone. I think there are lots of examples, and I want to move us quickly into the discussion space, but where we can share examples of how we already do universal design, right? Through collaborative work, through peer review, through a focus on the learning process rather than just assessing its products, right? The move towards multimodal and digitally mediated forms of student engagement. Those things can all be seen as having roots as retrofits, but they've now become mainstream teaching techniques. The question is, what do you already do that fits this concept of universal design? I think that during our forced pivot to teaching online during this pandemic, we came to understand, and these are my little soapbox issues, I have a few of them here, reminders of things that we did change that I think we need to hold on to, right? I think we were forced to understand or compelled to understand attendance and participation in really new ways. We were forced to create more expansive ways for students to learn and to move what they learned outside of just 50 to 80-minute chunks when they were in a room with us. And I think we should never assess students' attendance or participation in ways that are based on only on being in the classroom in those chunks again. And that would be an example of universal design. I have some more I could talk about in terms of expanding that notion of participation, but I think we all can see that we had to change, right? And that's a change that we can hold on to. My own Faculty of Arts at Waterloo was told by an associate dean to pull back on assignments in spring of 2020, to assign less work. This allowed me and many of my colleagues to teach more, to connect with students more, and to assess less. And I'm asking, why should we ever go back? In winter of 2020, despite their centrality to educational culture, we were asked to find alternatives to timed in-person tests and exams. Well, they were never a good way to assess student learning in the first place. And despite the lore that supports their continued use, there's no research that shows that students learn more, retain more information, study more effectively, or even properly reveal what they've learned when a test or exam is timed. And at the same time, we're spending huge amounts of our accommodations budget and time on granted extending time in these kind of ineffective instruments. And I think that's kind of absurd. Testing in higher education is a significant creator of barriers, in particular for people with learning disabilities and mental health related disabilities. And it doesn't make sense to think that these students will experience anything like these barriers in the environment outside of school, where high stakes testing like experiences are extremely rare. You know, nobody walks into an engineering firm or a surgery and says, you know, put your pencil down or your scalpel down, whatever bridge you've drawn up or whatever stage in the surgery you're at, that's where we're stopping, right? So why would we train engineers or doctors or anyone else to think and to perform under those constraints? There will be other barriers for our students when they reach the world of work, but nothing like the barrier imposed by a time test. And likewise, the accommodations that the students will need in a professional capacity and could find really helpful, right? They're not going to look like the accommodations that we give in testing heavy classrooms. And that's a huge problem and a huge wasted opportunity. Ideally, the accommodations that students are used to getting and working through in higher education should be the same ones that they're going to want and need when they begin working, right? So we know that there are accommodations that can really help students in the classroom, including help with note-taking and record-keeping, technological solutions around communication and memory. And I also want to suggest that if we planned for more disabled students in our classrooms, we could really change the shape of higher education. It's a kind of innocuous but revolutionary question. What if we took all the energy we spent on adapting to an old educational regime into building a new one in which disabled students don't always need to ask for accommodations, but instead their needs are expected. For a term, we offered students the ability to choose credit or no credit grading instead of numerical grades. Why not explore this option for entire programs or the entire first year of university? What are grades really doing for us right now? And because they're certainly nowhere near as fair or rigorous or unbiased as we think they are. Finally, then, I'm going to share one more slide here. For the last decade or so, I've been working on a really long list of universal design ideas for the classroom. And they've been created collaboratively through workshops like this one. I call this places to start because that's how I want fellow teachers to approach them, as things to try or experiment with in their own teaching. So I want to challenge you all to visit that site and pick one of these universal design ideas to try. Thanks for your time today. I hope we can talk more and I can answer your questions. I think we can all agree that before COVID, our schools had too many unnecessary barriers in place for students and for faculty. During COVID, we all viewed and experienced new barriers, or we began to see the old ones from new perspectives. And now we have a chance, I believe, to build something different.
Thank you so much, Jay. That was just a treat, a delight. Excellent. And thanks so much for sending your slides ahead of time. Sure. And for providing us with the script and permission to record today, because this will be such a remarkable, helpful resource going forward. Certainly, it's yeah, I'm completely delighted. And I'd like to open up some time for interaction. So yes, if you'd like to make a comment or direct a question to Jay, raise your hand and I will acknowledge you, and then you can open your microphone and off we go. Adele, over to you.
So you were talking about how teachers should look at this link and pick something to try in their classroom. What can we as students do to try and push our programs and our teachers toward trying this, and to try and push our schools toward universal design?
Sure. I mean, that's a really tough question, right? Because it's just a huge power imbalance. And that process where students need to foreground a relationship with every instructor that's based on disability in a culture that stigmatizes disability puts students in a really difficult place. So I absolutely understand, and there's really interesting research on this. Neil Simpkins did a really interesting study on this, but just how and when students choose not to have those conversations as a form of kind of self-preservation, because it's a lot of work, right? Students have what's called a cognitive overload effect from all the managing they need to do around getting the accommodations that they need. So I'm saying all that to say that it should not fall on students, right? Faculty and staff have a responsibility to give students opportunities to shape their education without those power dynamics in place. And one of the most powerful things that I've seen is when disability services offices have student boards, right, that are not just performative. They're not just like a club for students with disabilities, but they're a place where those students can make tangible suggestions about accommodations as teaching changes, right? We have new teaching spaces and techniques and things all the time. And we need to work with students to figure out how to best adapt those spaces to make them accessible for all students. We need also ways to reward faculty and instructors who do universal design or who do accessible practices, because so often those things are invisible, right? And a group like yours can do some of that, because faculty need to be given ways it needs to be proven that it's worth investing this time, right, in making permanent changes to their teaching rather than a series of temporary ones. So I think tangible ways for students to give their feedback. There can be advocacy that part of the student evaluation of instruction, or whatever you call it on campus, gives students an opportunity to talk about the accessibility of the teaching. Because that's something tangible that faculty should be working on. But I'm not going to say that students should have to tell their teachers how to teach over and over again, because that's such a tough dynamic. There needs to be advocacy. And it's tough because I went through all these statistics, and the truth is disabled faculty are not getting accommodations themselves. They're in a situation where they can't necessarily be out about their disabilities even with their colleagues, because the stigma is so high, depending on what that diagnosis is or what their disability is. And they're all working really hard just to survive in higher education. So it's not an easy question to answer, but it's like the most important question, because we know the only way for this to move forward is for disabled folks to be listened to. Right? And everything else that comes top down is going to just reinforce ableism and demand a kind of normalcy that is out of step with what students actually need.
Yeah, I have another hand up, Ted. But Ted, before I call on you, I wanted to mention that my working group which is comprised of faculty, staff, and students, is going to be meeting with the Senate Teaching and Learning Committee in the first week of January to see what we can do from a policy, faculty handbook standpoint to bring into practice guidelines that significantly affect how much assessment, the timing of assessment, the consultation of faculty members within units so that they can see how much assessment is happening simultaneously, as well as including in all of our evaluations of teaching comments on universal design and appropriate accommodation. So, I mean, that's the first meeting we've had with that committee ever. so that's a good start. The other thing is every committee at Brock is required. Well, every committee that is public recruited at Brock is required to have student representatives, and so. There's got to be a way, I think, and maybe we should be collaborating more with BUSU on this, to meet with those student representatives before they go to their respective committee meetings and kind of arm them with background evidence, the kind of persuasive information that many university committees like to hear, so that they can kind of make their point. So I think there's some inroads that we can be making to allow students to work as a collective instead of having to do this individual, horrific, precarious work of engaging with faculty members one-on-one in ongoing ways, because you never know who you're kind of going to meet, right?
Yeah, and I think in combination with that, it's the opportunity for disabled students to talk with one another as well.
Absolutely.
I think is really, really important.
Yeah.
And because it's not transparent what you need to do to survive, and thrive. Right. And so, people need to share ideas and resources, because in general, disabled students are not seen as part of that kind of student support infrastructure,
right?
In a way. So we need to build it. Yes. And I love that idea, meeting with Senate, meeting with the teaching fellows within individual faculties, going and meeting with departments, and saying that universal design is not some cute little thing with a few little, teaching tips or techniques, or hacks or something. Yeah. No, it starts at the top with big things like assessment.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
And it's not a little things that individual teachers change. It's big things, right?
Exactly.
Structural things.
Yeah, structural. Exactly.
It's the architecture of the university, right?
Right.
And of learning. So yeah, I think that's wonderful and really important, because I see more and more universities talking about universal design, but it's not that. It's universal design as another responsibility for instructors to take on, to do a bunch of small little things, right? And it's the big things that matter the most. So I love that, because you're going to see more provosts, you're going to see more deans talking about universal design, right? And we need to be clear with them about what they really mean when they're saying
what they mean when they say it. Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yes. Okay. I see Ted, and then two Sydneys, and then Ashley. So over to you, Ted.
Yeah. Very excellent presentation. I enjoyed it very much. At this point in time, I don't meet the definition of having a disability. However, I'm even older than Maureen is. I'm in my
even older than I
am. I'm in my third year at Brock, and I find my body has a tendency to slow down, given the vast expense of the actual campus itself. Negotiating stairs for me is a real pain at this point in time in my life. The actual availability of elevators, depending on where you are. You take an elevator, but you got to walk way down a hall, take the elevator up to the next floor, and walk all the way back to where you're supposed to be going. I find that's a barrier. I may or may not have a disability in the future, but I mean, that remains to be seen. So speaking of assessments for this particular term, I'm only taking a 60% course load, so I've got my 3 courses. None of them have a final exam where you actually have to sit down and write in a timed manner. One of my courses, it does have a final exam, but it's okay, here's the questions. You got a week to do it. Write your essay, turn it back in, boom, that's your final exam. But I mean, those particular instructors, I think, have been doing this all along anyway. So that is something that I would love to see spread completely across the spectrum. I know of one particular student who has a lot of issues, and exams drives this particular student absolutely bonkers, to say the least. And I'll just stop my spiel right there.
Thanks, Ted.
Yeah, I think knowing and understanding. So if I can make a metaphor again, but that idea of getting around campus, like if people could actually see what the accessible pathway is to get from place to place, and understand and think about that and extrapolate it out over the course of a term, out of the course of a career, right? And just understand, like, no, getting through the campus, getting around this place is not easy, right? And some people just experience it as flow, right? There's a Sarah Ahmed quote about higher education, that when you're going with the flow, you just experience it as flow. When you have to go against it, it's violent, right? It's hitting a wall over and over again. And understanding that in terms of physical space, it's really important to understand that in terms of intellectual space, in terms of teaching, right? And I think about attendance and participation. During the pandemic, right, we understood that some students weren't going to have access to the internet all the time, that they weren't going to have, that they were on a different time zone, right? That they were going to have family responsibilities, that they were taking care of people at home, or other people were learning at home, right? And it was this big, like, light bulb went off of like, oh, wow, people's access to education is really different and varied, right? As if it always hadn't been, and as if it's not always going to be, right? And so, like you said, when you've experienced it, all of these barriers all the time, and other people don't recognize them, right? There's something really satisfying, but also makes you angry when they finally do, right? Because it's never been an equal playing, it's never been a even playing field, And I guess the key is that we keep reminding people that it's not going to be, right? And that some of those means of accessing the information, of showing what we know, right, of getting engaged in learning, they need to remain broad, or else we'll go back to, basically wearing out those same people over and over again. The course load thing, I think one of the most effective accommodations for students in Ontario is taking a really, really low course load, right? But OSAP doesn't recognize that very well. Institutions get you in trouble for doing that, right? Because you're not giving them your money as rapidly, right? As you should be. You get marked out as a student who's not can't be a major, right? Or can't remain in a program. And instead, what if we pulled back on some of those demands so that a regular course load was not an unreasonable expectation of anybody? I mean, there was a student at Waterloo that did a study of sleep and how impossible it would be to actually have a healthy amount of sleep for any student, given the work demands at an Ontario university, right? At a certain point, you have to look at that and say, if students don't even have enough time to sleep 5-6 hours a night, then something has to change.
Thank you so much. Okay, let us hear from Sydney Sloan. Over to you, Sydney.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Dolmage, for coming and speaking to us today. That was Absolutely awesome. Just to kind of touch on the representation point. So yeah, it is great that Brock does have student representation on Senate and on board. However, Brock has some of the lowest student representation on Senate and on board at the university level. We only have 8% of voting students. Of the votes on Senate are student votes, and only 3.8% of the votes on the university board are student votes, and those are ex officio votes tied to BUSU offices. BUSU is part of the Ontario Undergraduate Student Alliance, which is a university 150,000 student strong lobby group, provincial lobby group, and this is a big thing that we're currently working on, is increasing student representation and increasing the cohesiveness of student representation across these university decision-making bodies. And kind of like you were saying, Dr. Dolmage, it's when it's for and by, and when, especially when speaking in the context of disability, like things that would benefit disabled people benefit everyone. It makes the world more accessible, which is the entire premise of universal design. And it's just like, for example, like the student wellness and accessibility, I'm on their student advisory panel, which is fantastic that they have a student advisory panel. However, that panel has no power. It's just consultation. And so all of this representation is great, but until that representation is quantifiably making impact on policy, it doesn't really do a whole lot. So yeah, if hi professors and faculty who are here, if you'd like to work with us on that, BUSU is more than happy to do so. But yeah, I think that's a really important point, and definitely something that needs to be worked on across all of academia moving forward.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'd love to hear more about that. I'd love to stay in touch, because I think I'd love to support that in whatever way I can.
We would be very appreciative. Dr. Connolly, I believe you are muted.
Yes. Yeah, I would say, Sydney, those are just great points, because one of the things that I'm hoping is going to happen is that representation is going to be more than tokenism, because, you know, with the low percentages of students and the lack of power, it's like box checking, but not real. It's not real. So we really, we need to move it beyond, I checked this box and it makes me look like I'm respecting students and I'm consulting students. So it's like performative, but not, you know, performative in the worst sense, the way Ahmed talks about performative, that kind of discounts its own existence. So yeah, moving beyond tokenism, that's a huge, huge step for us. Yes, totally. Sydney Hollander.
Hi, thank you. Let me put my hand down. Great speech, Dr. Dolmage, very engaging and interesting. I wanted to touch upon what you said about how no one goes into an operating room and tells a surgeon to put your scalpel down and tell me everything you know. Because I think that really speaks on how the education system is not catered towards real life scenarios in the workforce. I work at a hospital in the surgical unit, and I work with board certified surgeons and very, very qualified occupational therapists, physiotherapists, doctors, nurses, you name it. I work with them. And there are days where sometimes they just don't know the answers. So they go on to handy dandy Google on their phones or their computers and they look it up, or we have textbooks in the med room, and it's accessible. Information is always accessible. And I think that the education system not allowing us to have access or learn how to properly use these resources really says a lot about you know, ableism, and how everyone is supposed to know everything, memorize everything, regurgitate everything, and never forget it and be perfect. And not everyone learns that way, and it's just not a good representation of real life, in my opinion. And you know, I've seen that firsthand, so I think it's super interesting that you touched upon that.
Yeah, I agree completely. It's interesting, like you could look at the medical sphere, or have even looked at veterinary education. And, you know, in the actual world of work, there are companies like and practices that are extremely popular, right? Because they take memory work out of it, right? Like sophisticated note taking and gathering technology, right? So that nobody has to remember stuff like that and or make mistakes based on omission, right? And so that notes can be shared amongst the different practitioners freely, right? Carefully.
And
And yet we
also,
won't let students collaborate to write notes in our classes.
right. And
You know,
also,
it's
one doctor will
bonkers.
go to another doctor, a doctor will ask a nurse, and like who's to say that your peers aren't there to help you? Because in real life, they're
Yeah,
there to help you. Why
asking
can't
for
you
help. Yeah,
take an exam with another individual? Why can't you, like you said, take notes with another individual? Group learning is, I mean, personally, when I talk about something with someone, that's how I study. Michael and I, who's in here, we took a lot of classes together during our undergrad, and we would always, go on teams and be like, hey, let's talk about this so we can understand it together and ask each other questions and learn each other's perspectives. And that helped, I think, both of us learn a lot better than if we were to sit in our rooms and stare at our notes and reread them over and over and over.
yeah. And it's really important to say that part of the technique for arguing for these things is that for a long time, people were saying, no, it's really hard, it's really rigorous, it's really tough because we're preparing them for the real world. And we need to say, okay, if your goal is prepare them for the real world, let me give you some better strategies for that, because what you're doing is not working. Waterloo, it's some irony, right, that I'm the one talking about academic ableism, and I work at Waterloo, which is perhaps the most ableist institution in Canada. But our students go out and do co-op work terms, and the employers are really ticked off because what the students have learned how to do is compete with one another. And that is not what they want in a workplace. All the students hiding their work from one another because they're competing. They're not learning how to collaborate. They're not learning these other things. They're learning how to go off by themselves, memorize a bunch of stuff, and then perform incredibly well on these kind of timed tests and exams. Not communicate with one another, not collaborate, right? Not share labor, right? And find different areas of expertise. So anyway, it's just all goes to say exactly what you're saying, Sydney, which is, we should be really well prepared with these kinds of arguments, because there's a huge mismatch between what we're spending so much time and energy on right now versus what we could be. That's what's revolutionary to me, is like, can we free up all that labor and money that goes into that older kind of regime? And if we freed it up, lots of really interesting, innovative stuff we could be doing that would be so good for all students.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sydney. Ashley.
First off, awesome presentation. I grew up in an era where we were just kind of like shoved underneath a holiday tree or a Christmas tree and forgotten about. It's the present that, is hiding in the corner. Or we were shoved off in sped classrooms and forgotten about.
Yeah.
Which I was okay with, because I'm on the spectrum and classrooms can get super noisy, and then I couldn't understand what the teacher was saying, because back then there was no such thing as closed captioned. Or maybe there was, but my school was just too cheap. Who knows? Probably a bit of both. And I would beg for accommodations, and they would say, oh, you don't need that. It's not fair for the other children, blah, blah, blah. But I'm getting pushed down in the halls. They wouldn't put the handrails that you see in the aged care facilities for me to hang on to, so I could walk in the hall with my friends and stuff like that. That's sort of why I gave up on higher education, because in 2007 I applied to go to a college in Northern Ontario, and I just sort of pieced out because they weren't super accommodating, even though they pride themselves on disability accessibility, or whatever their slogan was. And they just sort of said to me at the end of the program year, we're gonna have a meeting with the dean, and then we'd like you to think about going into I don't know what it's called nowadays, but it's kind of like paying to go to high school, basically, which was a joke. I really, really wanted to study developmental service worker to get in, to get into university, so I could design PECS system, which is picture exchange communication system. when I was little, I really wanted to be a speech pathologist. And I was always told, no, you're too dumb. This is, 90s terminology. You're too dumb. You'll never get into university. And then so I kept fighting, and then eventually my poor body gave up because it was hard to fight for everything, every single day from like K to college. But they didn't understand that some of the brightest minds have autism, or dually diagnosed, like for instance Albert Einstein.
Yeah, and I think my own family was involved in the disability rights movement in Canada, and we lost a Supreme Court of Appeal case, Dolmage versus Muskoka Board of Education, for my brother's right to go to school with my sister and I. Now that was changed. Families that came along afterwards won that right to be included in K-12 education. But then what we've seen is that that's no longer real inclusion, right? It's often really tokenized. Or families
they're like, oh, here, we'll give you, I don't know, like Cougar bucks for including student A in music class.
Yep. And
it's
terrible,
because I felt terrible in elementary school, because to like make therapy fun, they'd say, oh, pick so and so to go with you, and then I'm pretty sure the teacher was paying them off with like chocolate or something.
Yeah. Well, the other piece then is that we do have a partially publicly funded higher education system, right? And students do have a right to an education. And right now that system is for a very narrow group of students. And everybody's paying into a public system that's really only reproducing privilege and a kind of discrimination, right? So I think that there are actually policy, there are legal, there are Ontario human rights channels, because I think right now, if we really look at those statistics carefully, we can say that there is a large group of students who are being denied the right to an education.
Exactly, because I often get told, well, life's not fair. Not everything in life is fair. Well, what? I think of this like little cartoon that I saw with two people standing on a fence. It's all got boxes, and they all get like boxes to stand on, but they're tailored to their height.
Yeah.
But why can't like society do stuff like that?
Well, if I can be real for a second, I mean, part of the problem is it's not fair, but the people who are saying that, it's been unfair in a way that gives them advantages.
Yes.
That's the real difficulty in higher education. The people who are least likely to accommodate students, least likely to have a teaching practices, are the people who are tenured and powerful, because they would need to admit that they got their privilege in an imbalanced system, one that really favored them as, for example, white males, cis white males, from particular family backgrounds. You look at the number of faculty whose parents were also academics. It's a system that is built this way to reward a certain group of people. And those people who could change it are the ones who would have to admit that maybe they didn't deserve the privilege that they had. And that is really hard for people to do. That's a big piece of how ableism works in higher education. So we have a large generation of faculty who are retiring, right, over the next 15, 10, 20 years. How can the next group of people stepping into that incredible privilege of being a tenure track academic take some responsibility for the fact that the system that's rewarded them so far is not a fair one, and that the university should not continue? They say in the States that every university wants to look like Harvard in the 50s. Well, most Ontario Canadian universities want to look like Oxford in the 20s. Yes. Right? If they keep looking that way and students don't look, it just is a mismatch between what the faculty looks like, right, and the background they have, versus increasingly the background and the demographics of students. And that is a clash that cannot continue, right? There needs to be a change.
Right. Thanks, Ashley. We've got two more hands up, and then I'm going to shift over to our celebration of our Innovation Award winners. Okay, so Michael and then Adele. Adele will have the last question. Over to you, Michael.
Hi, Jay, that was really incredible. As someone who recently graduated from Brock, I found so much of the presentation just really, really relatable, and things that I've felt like I've experienced throughout my undergrad. So it's nice to hear that these issues are being thought about and acknowledged, at least by some people. But one area that I see as a problem, you guys were starting to touch on with the conversation with Ashley, is the idea of tenure with professors. I know it can be a bit of a touchy subject at times, but I have seen a common trend of professors with tenure having much more complacency and much more unwillingness to change. For example, this isn't even related to accessibility, but seeing professors give information about kinesiology from the 80s or 90s, it shows that inherently there's a sense of complacency with a certain amount of tenure that I just didn't see nearly as often with younger and newer professors. So I just wanted to bring up that issue and see what your thoughts were, whether or not tenure needs to be reevaluated, or if there is enough, if there's enough rules and regulations in place to encourage professors to update their program, to look at what they're doing and look what's working, what's not working, to actually make some changes. Because that was something I found very, very frustrating as an undergraduate student, to say the least.
Thanks, Michael.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question, Michael. It's a good one. I don't have a quick and easy answer for it. I don't think the solution is to get rid of tenure, because we've got a huge, huge gulf right now. The majority of classes, for the first time ever, are being taught by non-tenure academics, and most of those folks have no job security. The university gives them limited contracts so that they don't have to give them benefits. They're cobbling together a career teaching at 2 colleges and a university. That's not a formula. Those folks do not have long careers. They burn out very quickly. But it's almost impossible to put together a living wage or support a family or pay for housing, right? So there's the tenure issue. Yeah, there's a group who are given a lot of power and they're rewarded almost solely for their research, right? A big piece of it is that there's no reward whatsoever for being a good teacher. And there's no training for being a good teacher. So they don't care. Why should they, right? They get rewarded for doing well with their research. So one thing that more universities are looking at is rewarding tenure for folks who are teaching stream, who do care about their teaching more, right? And I've got a lot of colleagues at University of Waterloo who are teaching 4 or 5 courses a term, 3, 4, 5 courses a term, who, if I could snap my fingers and immediately give them tenure to continue teaching so well, that would be a good, big, nice solution. But universities don't want to do that because they could pay those people by the course, right? When they don't need them, they can get rid of them. When they need more of them, they can grab more of them. It's like being an Uber driver for education. So, we're in a pretty big crisis as a society around work, right? Around labor. And I don't think the solution will be to take away permanent jobs, right? Or take away job security, to be honest. And I know that's not really what you're saying. And I want to admit that I see what you're talking about very much. It's why I say the people with the most privilege, the most seniority, they're the least likely to do accessible teaching, right? That's a big problem. But I don't think the solution will be to get rid of tenure. The solution to me would be give more tenure, give more job security, but reward people for teaching,
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I totally agree. I do think that tenure is important. I'm almost wondering if there should be, you know, a certain amount of clause or rules or regulations to require more reflection and insight into how effective their teaching is, rather than just sort of being like, you know what, you're secure, you can do whatever you want, and you know, the students just have to deal with that. And I think the idea of giving more tenure is a great idea. Even just providing newer professors with some sort of sense of security as well could definitely be important. Because again, as I mentioned, some of the newer, younger profs who come in fresh into university often have really great perspectives and different methods for teaching, for sure.
Thanks, Michael. Adele, you have the last question, comment, and over to you.
Thank you. So I noticed one of the areas around the university that's a big problem with accessibility is the accessibility office itself, surrounding documentation. So I know a lot of cases they require 2 doctor's notes, or they require a doctor's note from 2 different kind of doctors. They won't help with conditions that aren't officially diagnosed. So for example, I have Asperger's, and as a child, I had a lot of other medical issues. So I never got formally diagnosed with Asperger's. But my doctor agreed, my teachers agreed, like, I have Asperger's, I just never got it diagnosed. But now that I'm at school, I can't get any support for it, because it was never officially diagnosed by, and I can't find anyone who will diagnose me as an adult. So things like that, where they require an overabundance of documentation in order for us to even access these supports. In the absence of universal accessibility or universal, I forget what you called it.
Yeah.
So do you have any recommendations on this side of it? You know, obviously it would take a lot for schools to become automatically accommodating and not have to go through an accessibility office. But in the meantime, that's like, this is my 4th post-secondary institution, so I'm in kind of a unique situation where I can compare a lot of different schools' accessibility programs. And of the 4, Brock is the best, which tells you a lot about the state of other schools. But I've noticed this is a trend at all the schools I've been to, where they require so much more documentation than what would be necessary to prove that I have this disability and require accommodations. And I think it comes down to it that they should kind of just trust that students know what they need, instead of requiring, oh, you know, you say you have this and you say you need this accommodation, but let's hear from your doctor. Like, even in the case, I have a scooter that I used to get around, and I needed 2 doctor's notes attesting that I needed wheelchair accessible accommodations in place, even though I went to the office in my scooter and they can see that I'm in the scooter. Like, it's things like that where, like, you can clearly see it. I'm not making it up.
Yeah.
But I still need 2 medical professionals to attest to it.
Yeah.
It's kind of ridiculous.
I agree. Yeah. I mean, you see interesting things in the States where, for instance, you know, in the state of California or the state of Arizona, they know that there's going to be a lot of undocumented students, right? That just means students who don't have citizenship in the United States. That's forced them to say, we can't ask for doctor's notes. Those people can't go and get them, right? Well, most Ontario universities now have huge numbers of international students who have a very difficult time getting to see a doctor. There's a shortage in family doctors, right? In walk-in clinics. Like, where are you going to go, literally, to go and get it? And the offices need to know that, right? If you're sending somebody to go get this, where are they going? What do they have to pay when they get there, right? But it gets back to the argument I was making at the beginning, because there used to be an accountability agreement that every university in Ontario had, that they had to show that they were increasing supports and numbers of disabled students. The numbers aren't going up. So the official numbers of students seeking help are not going up, even as the number of disabled students is going up. And that's a huge problem. And one of the barriers is diagnosis. So if you know that there's a system where something like 2/3 of students are not seeking accommodations in classes when they have a right to them, you have to change and remove the barriers. So how can you do that? How can you make diagnosis easier for students? I don't think we're asking those questions. And again, it becomes out of the purview of the Disability Services Office. The average operating budget of these offices is tiny, and the number of full-time staff there is tiny, right? But you go over and you look at a student success office that offers tutoring, they're huge, and their budgets are getting bigger and bigger. They're getting big gifts, right? That they're allowed to use the money from, you know? And student fees are going in a huge amount to those places, so that they can grow, because the idea is they should grow. More students should be going there, and the more students that go, the more money they should get. That's not the model in accessibility services offices. It's just not. And that just has to change. It's going to take a human rights complaint, though, or a series of them.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, yeah, but it's a really good point. And if there's anybody who works in those offices now, I really think we need to be creative about allowing students to get the accommodations they need in a timely manner. And a big piece of that can be taking away some of those barriers.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jay.
Yeah, thank you all. And I'd love to connect with your group again in the future and support what you all are doing. So thanks so much for the opportunity.
Oh, it's a pleasure, a total pleasure. And thanks for being so generous with the time around interaction. That's a rare pleasure. That's really
sure. That's
quite
the best
gracious.
part. Yeah, best part. It's nice to meet you all, and TGIF, and good luck with the end of term, and hopefully we can connect again.
That would be wonderful. Thank you, Jay.
Okay.
So now it's my pleasure to introduce two groups of individuals who applied to the Innovative Design in Educational Accessibility. And I'm going to get them to say just a few words about their projects, and then offer a little bit of time for interaction, and then we can do a nice closure on our event. So I'm going to turn it over to Talia Rotondo to talk about shells, and then I'll be turning it over to Michael Zoutautis to talk about side by side. Over to you, Talia.
Hello, thank you so much for inviting me to this really fun event, and I just learned so much, and sorry I joined a little late, but things happen in life. So can I quickly just share like my 4-slide presentation to show you what Shells was about?
Sure.
Yeah, okay, sweet. Let me just do that then. Oh, I'm not allowed to share. Oh. Too bad. Okay, so I'll just chat about it with you all. So essentially, Shells was an app that my team had created. So it's definitely not just me who created it. This is the whole peer-to-peer office at Gender and Sexual Violence, or some peers who worked on it. And essentially, this app is about, well, it's called Shells, but it stands for Sexual Health, Education, Love, and Support for those living with disabilities. And essentially, our vision was to create a mobile app that provides personalized and accessible sexual literacy education and support for individuals living with disabilities. So that was our main vision and goal for this app. And in developing it, a really big and important part of this piece was actually consulting the community rather than just going off of our assumptions, which is not okay. So we had 3 fantastic interviews. There were semi-structured, in-depth interviews with women with disabilities or women who identify as disabled. And we had some amazing and important takeaways from those conversations. And essentially, we learned that they experienced little to no sexual health or consent or boundary setting education throughout their lives, which is not okay. They found it important that we integrated the PECS system that Ashley referred to earlier into the app. So essentially including very accessible design that we hadn't considered before, rather than just making the app accessible from like an Apple standpoint or whatever. And then listing accessible community resources was very important, but also customizing those resources. So not just saying, hey, here are resources, there you go. It's what resources really do you need? And what resources work for you was important. And lastly, we actually modified one of our sections from self-care to self-love section, because it was really important that we focused on a positive body image, positive affirmations, and also like just talking about healthy sex and healthy masturbation and what that can look like, rather than just saying, here's the self-care you need, and then piecing out, essentially. So yeah, that was essentially those are the main takeaways from our conversations, but we had so many, we had 3-hour-long conversations, which were great. So yeah. And what that brought us was an app that had 4 sections in it. So these 4 components were learn, self-love, supports, and emergency services. So very, very quickly, learn was obviously about sexual health education, consent education, and boundary setting education, 3 very important components. However, it was noted that for these components, they had to be customizable, because not everybody enters with the same level of education, right? So that was a very important factor for us that we would have to figure out somehow to fit into an app, but I'll talk about that later. But just, it was important to note that it wasn't a one-size-fit-all. Next was self-love, like I spoke about, including that important self-love section where we really talked about loving ourselves rather than taking care of ourselves. And then the support section, like I said again, was the customizable section. And lastly, the customizable support section. And lastly, we had our emergency section, which was also important to be customizable, where people could essentially access emergency services, that were good for them, so not determining what emergency services were good for people. B, determining how they preferred to access them, because everybody uses this app in a different way, right? So maybe voice activation wasn't possible for everyone, or same thing with touch activation. So making that section customizable too. The name of the game was customizability for this app, essentially. Oh, I was gonna say one more thing, but yeah, essentially that was our app in a nutshell. And oh yeah, what we really envisioned for this app was not it to be just an app. App was step 1. Truthfully, if we could have all the resources in the world and do whatever we wanted, we would create the app first, which would then lead to a website. Again, because not all apps are accessible, right? Or not everyone can use apps or phones or tablets. So we wanted to grow it to a website, but then grow it to an organization, where truthfully what it would entail is doing the sexual health education ourselves everywhere, right? Implementing what that could look like, doing proper research with the community, and truthfully getting it to be a larger than life operation.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Cripping sex ed.
Sorry?
Cripping sex ed. Yes.
In a nutshell, sort of.
In a nutshell. No, that's great. Thanks, Talia. We are going to be sponsoring another event in the winter term where we actually get our groups to present. We're going to do some nice celebration of diversity. So stand by for that and the slideshow. So thanks so much. Now I'm going to turn it over to Michael to tell us about Side by Side. And then we'll do a nice little wrap up. Over to you, Michael.
Hi. Okay. Thank you. I just want to say, Talia, that is incredible. What an incredible idea. So to talk a little bit about Side by Side, I'll tell it in a bit more of a story format. That's usually what works better for me. But Side by Side a few years ago now was a program through Brock University where we would have adults who were either developmentally, physically, or mentally impaired, and we worked with them through pedagogy and activities, which would target specific developmental motor milestones to help improve their function, quality of life, as well as just being a really fun outlet for people with disabilities to exercise, as well as volunteers to learn and get a really valuable experience. And that was one of the most valuable experiences I had at Brock, hands down, easily. And Ashley, who is here today, has been one of the fundamental members of this program from day one. So it's incredible seeing her anytime, anywhere. So what happened was COVID-19, obviously, and that's when a lot of issues came across, in the sense that no more seeing people in person, no more touching, no more physical interaction. And that's where we were left with a real empty hole in our hearts, with a lack of side-by-side and being unable to do this anymore. So what started off as a supplementary way to run side-by-side turned into being a way that we want to continue to run, to be tangential to in-person. As we learned, it had so many benefits, which I'll explain. So essentially, the program started last August, where we would just run monthly social sessions, where we would get everyone who was a part of Side by Side, get them all together and just, talk, see how everyone's doing, and come in with some topics to discuss about. And that was just an hour long, sometimes two, depending on how much conversation we got into.
Michael, I just want to interrupt to make sure everyone knows that this was online, because we couldn't meet in person, so we had to set it up online.
Online.
Yes.
Thank you. Very important part. So yeah, this was all done online, so that we could meet at home through the pandemic, regardless of what was going on in the world. And eventually that just spawned more and more ideas for how we can make this more engaging and more beneficial. So then a few months later, we started doing exercise sessions, where we would exercise with the group, doing some circuit training. And then that developed into being something we found very beneficial, that we found other ways to change it by incorporating cans and towels to create resistance at home without the use of any equipment. And then we got more people involved, so we could do dance classes and boxing classes and interesting ideas, so that we turned Side by Side into more of a weekly and convenient and beneficial tool for not only the members of Side by Side, but for everyone who's volunteering as well. So coming a few months later, the idea competition comes around, and we have the idea that, what we're doing at Side by Side is already just so beneficial and working so well in eliminating so many barriers, like transportation and costs being completely free, and being open to anyone who is interested. We entered it in the competition, and we were thrilled to have won the first place for our category of distant learning, which was incredible. So that's kind of a summary of Side by Side, and it's something that's continuing to progress. We've incorporated the last little while one-on-one social interaction, so that we can have individualized groups who can specifically target accessibility needs of the individuals in the program, rather than doing group sessions that wouldn't necessarily perfectly tailored to everyone. And now we have new leadership. Unfortunately, I wish I could keep doing Side by Side full time, but it is under the new leadership of new volunteers who are offering their insights and getting their taste of this wonderful experience that I got to have with Side by Side. So I hope that did a Side by Side justice. I could ramble on for hours, but I will leave it at that. Oh, you're muted.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Michael. And we're delighted that we were able to get you and Talia here today to say a little bit about the projects, which we will celebrate in a more public and expansive manner in the winter term. So yeah, stay tuned for that, everybody. You'll be getting invitations about that. And so now it's my pleasure, finally, to thank you all for being here today, and for supporting our event, and for being such committed and engaged and supportive participants. And I want to thank so much our interpreters, Rosalie and Melissa, and apologize profusely, Melissa, for forgetting your name earlier. It's just one of those things that happen when you have a mind as full of stuff as mine apparently is. So thank you so much for being here, and we completely appreciate your support. It was wonderful. I'd like Allison just to say a few words to close us out from Human Rights and Equity Services. And then I will thank you all for being here and invite you to stay tuned for future invites. So over to you, Allison.
Thanks, Maureen, and thanks everybody for coming out today and joining us on the International Day for Persons with Disabilities. You know, this is an event that we in the Office of Human Rights and Equity, and certainly the Anti-Ableism and Mental Health group, take very seriously, and we you know, think it's important to celebrate all of the accomplishments that individuals are doing all over campus in this area. And I really appreciate everybody coming out, and when I have information on the next idea competition, I will certainly be sending that out. You'll see a Brock News article promoting it, and hope that any of the students that are here today start thinking about, you know, do they have ideas and ways of promoting accessibility and inclusion on campus, in their community, and in our world, and how those ideas might impact so many others in the world, as you've seen with Talia and Michael's presentations today. And yeah, thanks everybody for coming.
Thanks everyone, and stay tuned for future events from HRE and AAMH and the Center for Adaptive and Inclusive Physical Activity. Have a wonderful weekend, and please, please, please keep committed to anti-ableist and inclusive practices. Thank you so much.